Welcome to Renolda Church. Whether you're new here or have been a part of our community for some time, we're so glad that you're with us. Please take a moment to fill out the Connect card you received upon arrival. This card enables us to support you in prayer, and it also strengthens our connection across all our campuses. It's a fantastic way to stay engaged and connected with the Renolda Church family. Thank you for taking this opportunity to connect with us. Your year-end gifts are vital to the continued mission of Renolda Church. More than ever, people are looking for an answer, and we have it. The answer is and will always be Jesus. Every gift you make is an investment in changing the world through the message of the grace of Jesus Christ. You can give your year-end gift securely on our website or by downloading the Renolda Church app from your app store. From the bottom of all of our hearts here at Renolda, thank you for your continued faithfulness to the mission of the gospel work here in the Triad and throughout the world. Discover the power of blessing at our upcoming blessing service. We all need a positive, faith-filled vision spoken over our lives. Without it, we'll never rise to our God-given potential, but with it, we can let go of the past and move forward confidently in the favor of God. So gather with us for our unique blessing service and receive a personal blessing for you and your family. Get your year off on the right foot and harness the power of blessing. Use the link below to learn more. Again, welcome to Renolda Church. We are glad you're here. Let's worship together.
Well, hey there, Renolda Church. Are you ready for some good news? Jesus is King, a King in whom you can believe, a King you can build your life on in this new year. This is a week where New Year's coming around the corner and Christmas kind of merged together in 1 week. And so I thought we would turn our attention today to what happens directly after the birth of Jesus. I'll be reading from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 23 from the ESV. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and he took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all of the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because there are no more. Verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Rise, take the child and the mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and he took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard the Archelaus was reigning over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth. And what was spoken by the prophet might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. Family can be hard. All of the dynamics of Christmas, where families and friends and celebration are demanding on your time and demanding on your emotions and demanding on all of the things that are required of you during this season. And I was thinking of a story that was once told to me about a man who traveled with his family, including his mother-in-law, to the Holy Land. It was the trip of a lifetime. They were going there to experience the streets and the buildings and the locations where Jesus, their Lord, had lived. Unfortunately, while they were there, their mother-in-law went to be with the Lord. And they didn't know exactly what to do. So they talked to a lot of the rabbis and the priests and the people who lived in the Holy Land and said, what can we do with my mother-in-law? And they said, well, the easiest thing would be for us just to bury her here. It would give you an excuse to come back one day. It would give you a reason to celebrate your work here because she came here on this trip of a lifetime. And while she was here, went to the Lord. And the man said, no, we can't bury my mother-in-law here in the Holy Land. And they continued to argue with him and tell him about all the reasons that it would be great, and they would put her in a marked tomb, and that there would be a place for them to come back to. And he said, absolutely not. We just can't. We can't bury her here. We have to take her home. And finally, exasperated, one of the men said, I just don't understand. It's so difficult to get a body from here back to your city. You know, the travel and the permits and the planes and making sure the body is treated with dignity. I just don't understand why you won't let us bury your mother-in-law here. And he said, honestly, one time you guys buried someone here and he was raised from the dead. And I just can't take that kind of risk. I just can't take that kind of risk. You know, all of the Gospels are telling different portraits of the story of the arrival of Jesus. Some include his family, some include a birth narrative, some start right in the middle of the story. Mark's Jesus is a portrait of Jesus as a servant. John portrays Jesus as Lord. Luke, the physician, sees Jesus as the Savior of the entire world. And Matthew sees Jesus as a king. Here's some examples of the ways in which Jesus is portrayed in Matthew as king. In chapter 1, Jesus is the king that has inherited the throne of David. His birthright gives him the claim to be the king of Israel. And this happens in two unique ways. On Jesus' mother's side, he is from the line of David's son, Nathan. But on his adopted father's side, Joseph, he is from David's son, Solomon. There's a problem when you're going to claim to be the king, you're going to claim to be the Messiah, is that back in the garden, because of Adam's sin, we were all born sinful through the seed of Adam and the mother Eve. How in the world would we ever have a Savior who was the rightful heir to the throne of David by biological line, but at the same time didn't inherit the sin of Adam? Well, what would have to happen is that he would have to come from the line of David, but be adopted by Joseph, who was also from the line of David, but be born of a virgin so that he bypassed the inherited sin of Adam. So chapter 1 gives us Jesus who has inherited the throne of David. In chapter 2, we see Jesus is recognized as king, as these kingmakers from the Orient. These wise men come, and they come to crown him, to ordain him, to anoint him as king. And as a king, they bring with them gifts that were rightfully due a king of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And then chapter 2 continues, in any new king to Israel would be a threat to the current king of Israel. The current king Herod hated Jesus because he was the one to take his place. Herod, who had no right to reign in Jerusalem at all because he was an Edomite, feared Jesus. And so here you see in the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew that he's going to give us a portrait of Jesus as the rightful king. He is royal by genealogy. He is worthy of the throne because of his virgin birth. He is anointed as king from these kingmakers from afar. He is hated by the current king. And for additional proof, Matthew is going to go on to give us a whole series of ways in which Jesus uniquely fulfills Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah. There are 332 Old Testament prophecies about the coming Messiah, and anyone who would claim to be Messiah would have to fulfill all of those prophecies. Mathematician Peter Stoner talks about the likelihood that one person by chance could fulfill all of these prophecies. And he says the number that would describe the probability of any single person fulfilling all 332 prophecies by chance is a number that we can't understand. So what he did was he just isolated it to 8. What would it take for any single person in human history to fulfill just 8 of those prophecies? And the illustration he uses is he says, imagine that you took the state of Texas and you took silver dollars and you covered the entire state of Texas with silver dollars 2 feet deep. But as you were placing those, you marked one of them with an X. So you filled the whole state of Texas with silver dollars 2 feet deep, but one of them in some random place is marked with an X. And you took a blind man and you said, listen, we want you to find one of them. And we want you to find the one by chance that's marked with an X. What's the likelihood that a blind man could pick that silver dollar marked with an X from the entire state of Texas, buried 2 feet deep? That's the likelihood that one person could fulfill just 8 of these prophecies. Matthew is establishing Jesus as the king without question because he's the only person in human history who fulfilled all 332. And to make his point, he's going to focus on 4 cities that are connected to Jesus' real life and prophecy. Matthew 2, 4 through 6, we read, and assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them when the Christ was to be born. He said, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written in the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will be the shepherd for my people Israel. So the first city is Bethlehem, and Herod is so upset that when the Magi arrive and they proclaim that this Messiah has come, he puts all of the scribes, all the theologians and politicians, and he begins to ask them about this Christ child, and he becomes paranoid because he knows that his reign is about to come to an end. And Matthew actually quotes here from the prophet Micah. Ironically, a prophet Micah who is speaking to a dictator during his own day. And he says that Bethlehem was the place that this child would come from. And for Matthew, to come from Bethlehem is the unlikeliest of all cities. Bethlehem is completely insignificant. One of 1,000 small cities that dotted the hillsides around Jerusalem. But yet not only Jesus would come from the city named the House of Bread, but also David, from whose line Jesus would come with. The story continues that the Magi have now arrived. Now, there is a fanciful Christmas card picture of the Magi, these magicians, these wise men from the Orient arriving with the shepherds on the night of his birth. But that's not actually how it happens, because when it is known that Jesus has been born, word gets back to the wise men, and the wise men then begin to travel. So they probably arrived some months after the birth of Jesus. And by this time, Herod seems to be all worked up into a fury because people are celebrating that the Messiah has arrived. And the joy of this arrival has been a fulfillment of the prophecies, the words of Gabriel and Elizabeth and Zechariah and Simeon. But remember that Simeon also says when he's blessing the child on the 8th day in the temple, he says a sword will pierce through your own soul in Luke 2, so that thoughts from many hearts may be revealed. So Herod is a threat to everyone, including this Magi. And so the Lord tells the Magi to go back home a different way through an angel. And the Greek word actually here used for departed is actually used only twice in the New Testament. Once here and once later when talking about the way Jesus responds to hearing that John the Baptist has been beheaded. And the Greek word here for departed literally means to escape from danger. And so an angel comes to Joseph and he says, we need you to leave. We need you to leave, and we need you to go to Egypt. Now, Egypt is about a 75-mile trek. So from like here to Raleigh or maybe here to Chapel Hill. And they have to go on donkey. And this is a remarkably hard journey for a family that has a newborn. You know, when you have a newborn, we had 2 newborns during the Christmas season. One of our babies was born on December the 15th, and another one several years later on December 16th. And during that time, you don't want to leave the house. You don't want to see anybody. I remember in those first years when we have newborn babies, we're like, hey, listen, we're going to celebrate Christmas, but you have to come see us, and you can stay for like 11 minutes, and then you have to go. Because the whole world is oriented around feedings and sleepings and all of the things that come with that. The idea of traveling 75 miles with a newborn baby, and more than that, traveling to Egypt. The last time the people from Jerusalem were in Egypt, they were slaves. And so the idea of sending them back there seems remarkable. Why would the angels send them 75 miles back into a place where the last time they were there, they were slaves? And let me help you understand the context of why this is so important. Between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, there's a gap of history about 400 years. And during that 400 years, there's no prophet in the land. Jeremiah was the last prophet. He was the prophet to the king Zedekiah. Zedekiah is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II. And then there's no prophet until John the Baptist. So in this 400-year period, there is great oppression on the people in Jerusalem. And a Jewish family actually leads a revolt. And they lead a revolt. This family is called the Maccabees. And this family leads a revolt against the authorities. But at the same time, there's a gap in what's happening in terms of world empires too. By the time we open the New Testament, we're fully under the reign of Rome. But at the end of the New Testament, at the end of the Old Testament, you have a transition that's happening from Babylon to Persia. So at the end of the Old Testament, Babylon and Persia are the empire. You open the New Testament, and now the Roman Empire is in charge. Who's leading in between that? The Greek Empire. The Greek Empire. The Greeks were led by one of the greatest commanders, the greatest thinkers in all of human history. His name's Alexander the Great, and he was from an obscure town too. Much like Jesus being from Bethlehem, Alexander the Great was from Macedonia. And he knew the history of the Greek people, that frequently when there were new rulers, there were people who would persecute this small group of people in Macedonia. And so one of Alexander the Great's aims was to create a location where these people from Macedonia would find refuge. And so what he did was he went to Egypt. And after conquering Egypt, he established a town in Egypt that he named after himself, Alexandria. Alexandria, the home of maybe the world's greatest library. And he knew that he needed to build a city there in the middle of the desert for these Macedonian Greeks to find refuge. And he knew 2 things about these Jews that had fled during the Maccabean revolt. One was the last time they were slaves in Egypt, they had done massive building projects with these Jews that were there in slavery. But also he knew the renown of Jerusalem and its temple and all the building that had happened there. So what he did was he employed these Jews that had left during this period between the Old Testament and New Testament, during the Maccabean revolt, he employed them to build the city of Alexandria. And what he promised them was for the rest of time, any Jew, because of their great work in Alexandria, anytime they came back, they would find safe refuge in this town. And I got to believe that Joseph and Mary knew this. So when the angel of the Lord comes to them and says, you need to travel on donkey with your newborn 75 miles to Egypt, they knew they could go to Alexandria because Alexander the Great had promised the Jews that they would find safe refuge there. But what in the world would they do there when they arrived? Joseph was a carpenter. How would he find work? She couldn't work. How would he find work? Unless kingmakers from the east had come and brought gifts that were due a king, gold and frankincense and myrrh, that appeared to provide for all of the needs of this new family. for the nearly 4 years they were in Egypt. Now, quickly, the last two. We've been in Bethlehem, fulfilling that the Messiah must come from there. We now have fulfilled the prophecy that was spoken by the prophet of the Lord, out of Egypt I have called my son. And then in verse 16, Herod hears what is happening, and he sent and killed all of the male children in Bethlehem and all the region who were 2 years old and older, according to the time that he ascertained from the wise men. This was fulfilled, what was spoken by the prophet. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted because there are no more. Herod was tricked and he overreacted a little bit because now he's killing all of the children who are 2 and under. In Jewish culture, to be 13 months old was to be 2. And so now he's having anyone who is 13 months old to 2 years old under being killed there. And the prophet here that's quoted is actually Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a book full of utter distress and despair, except for there's one section in the middle, in chapters 30 through 33, where this is being quoted from, where we see there's a moment of hope. In the middle of despair, in the middle of weeping, lamentations, there is hope. What's the promise here? The promise here is that Jesus is about to do something that has never been done in human history. Ramah was a strange town. It was a staging city. It was in the middle of 2 lands, the northern and the southern kingdom. And it was kind of a staging ground for deportation, people that were going to be sent away, and a staging ground for armies that were about to go to battle. And it says that a voice was heard in Ramah, and the voice was Rachel. Rachel is the mother of the children, of part of the children of Jacob. 2 of those, Ephraim and Benjamin, Ephraim from the north and Benjamin from the south, with Ramah in between. She's weeping over them. Now, what's the promise here? The promise is that these 2 lands, who Rachel's weeping over, the northern and the southern kingdom, Ephraim and Benjamin, with this staging ground of Ramah in the middle. She's weeping over them, but it's the promise that when this king comes from Bethlehem through Egypt, that this weeping is the mark that the Messiah is about to bring back together the work. 3 cities: Bethlehem, Alexandria in Egypt, and now Ramah. And the 4th one he's going to point our attention to is Nazareth. It's now time to return home. They've been in Egypt living off the riches from the wise men's gifts for nearly 4 years. And they hear that Herod has died. But they also hear that Archelaus, his son, who's one of the worst leaders that ever, like bad people in the Bible, this son of Herod goes on the list. As a matter of fact, he's so bad that eventually the Romans come in and replace him. And they come in and replace him with Pontius Pilate, like the guy who washes his hands of Jesus when he's crucified. That guy. So they hear that Herod's son's now in charge, and so the angel tells them to go to Nazareth, to a town in Judea. They moved to Nazareth so that the scriptures could be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now you need to know that of all the slurs in the New Testament, being called a Nazarene is among the worst. As a matter of fact, in Acts chapter 24, Paul is being held at trial before Felix. And one of the claims they make about Paul in Acts 24 is that he is leading a group of Nazarenes. Meaning, among all of the claims that they can make about Paul, of all of the things that they could accuse Paul of, one of the worst things that he did was he led a group of Nazarenes. And so Jesus and his family traveled from Egypt, and not back home, but to Nazareth. And that's how he became a Nazarene. Think about what Jesus has gone through here. born in Bethlehem, an insignificant city, one of thousands of cities on the hillside looking up at Jerusalem. Born into poverty, adopted by his adopted father, born of a virgin to a teenage mom. Here he comes, and the shepherds are told that he has arrived, and they are told that it will be marked by a star in the sky. And so they travel after the star, and they meet the baby, and they bow down and they worship him. And word begins to spread that Jesus has arrived. And in doing so, these wise men, these kingmakers from the Orient get word, and they come to Jerusalem. And while there, they meet with Herod, and they ascertain where the baby is, and they go and they bring him gifts worthy of a king. And then they hear that Herod is furious, so they go back a different way. And when they go back a different way, an angel of the Lord comes to Jesus, who's now in Bethlehem, and they tell him to leave Bethlehem and not go anywhere but Egypt. Egypt, a town where a Jew without Alexander the Great would have certainly been put back into slavery, but God had made a way for them to have provision through these gifts, and a town where Jews would be welcome because of their great service to Alexander the Great. And for 4 years, they live off these riches that the wise men had brought. But then it was time to return. And we knew it was time to return because in Ramah there was a loud crying that was the promise that the northern and the southern kingdom were about to come back together. But in doing so, in Jesus bringing back together a divided kingdom, a divided world, bringing back Jew and Gentile, he couldn't return home because the only person worse than Herod was Herod's son. So in doing so, he goes to Nazareth. And in doing so, Jesus fulfills just 4 of the 332 prophecies that require that they be met for the Messiah to be anointed. From Bethlehem, through Egypt, cry of Ramah, be called a Nazarene. This is the story that follows our most familiar Christmas stories. Matthew opens with a genealogy, but then only Matthew and Luke give us insights to the arrival of the new baby. And Matthew wants to rightfully place Jesus on the throne of David as the King of the Jews for the world. But this text always irritates me a little bit. You're saying that not only had the Old Testament people with their kings and their prophets waited thousands of years for the Messiah to come. And generation after generation after generation had come and gone and come and gone and come and gone. And then there was a 400-year period where there were no prophets and no kings, where the people were just speculating. And then a new prophet comes, and Jesus has arrived. And the first thing that happens is he disappears for 4 years. Long waiting, anticipating, using a checklist with 332 Old Testament prophecies. And he just leaves? In with a bang and out with an escape? We are so terrible at waiting. We bought some Amazon items for Christmas that we decided we did not want. And so I went on Amazon, and historically, I've just had to drop them off at the UPS store. But for some reason, a lot of these packages that we had this year were being returned at Whole Foods. Now, I just need you to know, I don't go to Whole Foods. First of all, I'm deeply offended by how much they think an apple costs. But also, it's the worst parking lot in the city. It's impossible to get in and out of, and you're always having to park way away. So I just try not to go to Whole Foods. And so here I am walking with a box of gifts, and I come into the counter, I'm like, oh, there's no line. This is awesome. I found favor. And the guy said, oh, we don't do them at the counter anymore. There's a kiosk over there. And I look around the corner, and there are 1,100 people in line at the kiosk. And none of them know how to work it. They're all trying to pull up a QR code, a scannable thing on their phone, and it's not working. And I waited for like 6 minutes. I'm like, you know what? I'd rather just buy this stuff and give it to Goodwill other than wait in that line with all of those people. Now, I'm going to try again this week, one more time. But it's like, I haven't got any time for waiting. Now, the truth is, this line probably will be completely passed through in 15 minutes. But 15 minutes was just completely intolerable. I cannot wait for 15 minutes. These people have waited thousands of years for Jesus. 400 years with no prophet. He finally arrives. Shepherds celebrate. Wise men come and anoint. And he leaves. And he leaves. It's part of God's plan. If it's a part of God's plan, then it's for your good. And these things had to happen so that there was no doubt that Jesus was the Messiah. From Bethlehem, through Egypt, loud cry in Ramah, so that he could be called a Nazarene. No one other than Jesus could make a claim that they were the Messiah. God's work in the world is always for our good. And sometimes you think that you know the best path from where you are to where you need to be. Sometimes we're surprised that path takes us through Egypt. In John Piper's most recent book called Providence, he traces God's work in the world through the entirety of Scripture, and he concludes with this parable. One day, a very wise old man named Albert received in his old age the greatest gift he'd ever received, a daughter whom he named Claire. And he loved that little girl, and that little girl loved her dad. One day, Albert asked Claire if she'd like to go on a journey, and she exclaimed, "Yes, I would love to go on a journey." And he said, "Well, we're going to go on this journey, but we don't have a whole lot of money, so what we're going to do is we're going to travel, and whenever we get to a nice place, I can't promise it will be nice, but we'll ask people to take us up in their homes. Because Claire, I believe that God always has a solution for our every need." Claire smiled and said to her dad, "And even if things go bad," she said, "God makes them turn for good. Right, Daddy? Just like that little poem you told me, Daddy. When things don't go the way they should, God always makes them turn for good." He said, That's right, Claire." So they started the journey, and after many hours, they came to a cottage where a very poor man and his wife and his child lived. And while they were there, they knocked on the door and asked if they could stay. And the family said, "We don't have much to offer, but we welcome you into our home." And they even gave them the master bedroom, and they gave a great meal to the family. And this family was provided for by a single cow. And this cow was known for producing the best milk. And this poor family that had welcomed him, Arthur and Claire, provided for them a nice home with a warm bed and a nice meal that night and some of the milk from this prized cow. They went to bed the next morning. Arthur and Claire woke up and they heard wailing in the other room. And they went into the other room and they found that the family was grieving that their one cow had died. And overnight the cow passed away, and so the man who owned the home, his family, who had been provided for by this cow, they said, "Well, what we'll do is we'll cut up the meat and we'll sell the meat, and we'll get enough money from the selling of the meat from this dead cow that we'll buy another cow." And Arthur went and said, "Listen, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I would bury that cow out in your yard, and I would just trust the Lord. I would trust the Lord that He knows what your needs are, and He always has a solution." So that's exactly what the man did. He buried that cow in the backyard. And then Claire and Arthur went on their way, and they traveled the whole day. And that night they came to a lavish estate. And they knocked on the door, and they asked the man if they could stay with him for a night. And he said, "Well, I guess so." He provided them crumbs from his table and water to drink that was dirty, and wouldn't let them live in the main house, but made them sleep in the barn. The next morning they got up, and Arthur had noticed at night that the fence in the backyard, the bricks were beginning to crumble. And so he went out and he bought of his own account bricks to fix this fence. And he fixed the fence like new. And they went in, Arthur and Claire did, to tell the rich man, thank you for his hospitality. And he grumbled and he said, everyone just begging all the time. No one wants to work. Just needy people all the time. Be on your way. So Arthur and Claire, they traveled another day. And that night they were sitting at a fire. And Claire had enough. And she said, Dad, I don't understand. I don't understand what just happened. You said God provides. But in one case, the people who were the kindest, most gentle, most gracious people, their only cow died. And you told them to bury it and just trust the Lord with no plan. And the other man was so ungracious, so mean, so hateful, and you went and fixed his fence at our expense. He's clearly wealthy. I don't understand how it works out that the God knows our needs and He'll provide for us. Arthur set Claire on his knee and he said, sweetie, I'm going to tell you what happened. But in doing so, I want you to promise me that you'll always trust the Lord, that He knows your need and will provide. She said, I promise that, but I need to understand. He said, well, when we were having dinner with the poor family the night before, I noticed that the milk was bad, meaning that cow was diseased. And so if they had cut up the meat of this dead cow and fed it to the people of the city, they would have made many people sick and many people would have died. So the Lord came to me and He said, tell that man to bury that cow. And in doing so, I will reveal to him a great treasure that was buried in the ground many years ago that will provide enough money for their family to buy 2 cows. So I told him to bury that cow and trust the Lord, knowing that the Lord had already made provision. For the man who was wealthy, at night I noticed that there was a great chest of gold that had been exposed by the crumbling wall, buried in this wall by the masons many years ago. The Lord came to me and said, if that man finds that gold, it will destroy him. So bury that gold back in that wall so he'll never know. You see, Claire, Arthur said to his sweet daughter, the Lord had gone before, because the Lord's always working all things together for our good, His glory, and our joy. As we enter into a new year, all of us are sitting down and writing down a list of the ways in which we hope next year will be different than last year. Some of them are related to our physical body. Some of them are related to our finances, our vocation, our family, how we use our time, how we use our treasure, how we use the other resources of our life, the relationships we want to invest in. But here's the deal. As much as we are invested in our future reality, as much as we are invested in our new year, we have the assurance that Jesus is even more invested. He's gone before us. While in the natural, it seems ridiculous to send the Savior of the world from Bethlehem to Egypt to Ramah to Nazareth. But it was the only way that we could be assured that Jesus was who He claimed to be. See, sometimes the path we think is best, the path we think is clearest, from where we are to where we want to be, isn't the best path for us at all. Sometimes the best path is through Egypt. To an unbelieving world and even to our own minds, Egypt feels like the hardest, the most desperate, the most random place to go to get us to where God wants us to be. And in fact, Egypt was always the answer. So God made a way. As we start this new year, we can build our lives on our commitment to do better, do the right thing, say the right thing, be more disciplined, have better habits. Or we can build our lives on the only thing that matters. And that's how much God has invested in us knowing Jesus. Jesus, who came and lived the life that we could never live, died the death that was rightfully ours, was raised on the third day, was the fulfillment of all 332 prophecies. He was the assurance that from the town of David, the house of bread, Bethlehem, he would come. Jesus was the assurance that from Egypt, the prophet would send Jesus, and there Jesus would find flourishing and protection. And out of Ramah, there would be a cry. There would be the assurance that Jesus would bring all people, Jew and Gentile, to him in faith that believe. And then he would come to Nazareth so that he would be called a Nazarene, fulfilling all of the scriptures. And in doing so, Jesus becomes the rightful heir, the rightful claimant, the rightful inheritor of David's throne. Build your life on something. You have two choices. Build your life on your commitments to be better, or build your life on God's commitment to you that he's proven in Jesus, who came, who lived, who died, and now reigns on your behalf. Renolda Church, a new year with new and fresh opportunities to focus your attention afresh, not on how good you are, but how good God has been to you in Jesus. And that's the gospel.